That he works for NHL.com has no life. This man would email me or text me at 5:30 on a Saturday morning to ask me for a score sheet to make sure that he knew the facts about Maurice Rocket Richard's 5-goal game, the exact minute and whatnot. So accuracy is synonymous with Dave Stubbs. I'm very proud to welcome Dave today. Dave Stubbs, it's all yours, sir.
Carl, thank you. I see you've arrived with a bow tie. I don't own a necktie. It goes on for game time, but not before. So, thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. I want to first give a shout out to Carl. Some of you might have seen the NHL 100, the 100-minute documentary that aired on Sportsnet a couple nights ago and will be appearing on television in a variety of places in the next little while. Waxy was part of that, as was Eric. Some wonderful observation and wonderful historical background that they provided on that. But Carl spoke a little bit to the suspension of Rocket Richard in 1955, which was actually Red Fisher's first game ever on the beat. Red goes down to the Montreal Forum and his city editor sends him in. He goes in expecting there to be perhaps a bit of trouble because of the suspension that's come down, and they're not quite sure how the fans are going to react. Of course, the smoke bomb goes off. The fans start to riot. Red goes out to a payphone, calls his boss and says, they're rioting down here. And his boss says, well, you better get back into the building. Get me some color. Red says, you want color? You come down here. So anyway, to Carl's observation about it all, it was the best line, I think, Carl, in the 100 minutes of that entire production, when Carl said, and I quote, they didn't suspend a hockey player, they suspended God. And if you know anything about hockey in this city in the time of the Quiet Revolution in the 1950s and how Rocket Richard was more than just a hockey player that he always just wanted to be, that very much cuts to the chase. And Carl, you nailed that, because they suspended God and we all saw what happened. God's disciples went on a rampage in Montreal and trashed the place, right? So now, of course, they just burn police cars when the Habs win a series, or don't. Being here today is the 115th anniversary today of the birth of Eddie Shore. We are on the eve of the NHL's 117th birth at Le Windsor, so that is actually tomorrow. And the Stanley Cup's at 125, so I think it's very, very fitting that you've invited a fossil to come to talk to you today. So thank you. I mean, the history of hockey is something that is just hugely important to me. I've been in the sports journalism business for probably about 41 years now. I started, my first job was in 1976 at a small community newspaper outside of Montreal on the West Island in Point Claire. The paper no longer exists. I worship the Montreal Canadiens. I collected beehive photos. That I have any of my original teeth is a miracle, because I made my mom buy so much of that junk to get the hockey photos, right? I mean, all of us, or some of us at that age did. I chopped up Hockey Illustrated. I collected the Coke bottle caps, learned to read a hockey summary from the Montreal Star, the Gazette summaries. I would embarrass Red Fisher by telling him that I loved what he wrote, and I followed him as a kid. And I collected my own scrapbooks. First job was in 1976. The very first story that I ever wrote, the first feature story that I wrote, was on Dick Irvin Jr. about his broadcast career, and I still have that in a scrapbook, and I looked at it before I came here today. My God, is it bad. You go back and you're not too far out of high school, and you're not too far out of studying to be a writer, and you read this stuff and it's absolutely horrible. So the first story that I wrote about an actual hockey player was Ian Turnbull, a defenseman for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and Ian had played his junior B hockey for the West Island of the Point Claire Flyers. And I interviewed him at the Montreal Forum, and for me to go in there as a writer and to say, look, I'm at the Forum to interview a hockey player, was incredible. So I went back and I read that story. It's terrible too, but even worse are the photographs, because if any of you have lived in Montreal for any length of time, you may remember a place called Dorian Soup, which is an absolutely awful men's clothing store. Well, I'm wearing, I think, a vinyl jacket, and I've got lapels out to here and the whole bit, and I'm interviewing Ian Turnbull. But for me, that was the start of really starting to do something that I really enjoyed. I mean, I began on Underwood typewriters. I still probably have the smudges of black and red ink on my fingers. I graduated to a Tandy 200 laptop computer. I went down to Plattsburgh and bought it for a couple $100. It flipped up. You could write about 2 or 3 stories on it before you had to erase them, because the hard drive literally contained nothing. I mean, there was no memory on these things at all. To file a story, you had these little couplers which looked like Mickey Mouse ears. You would use the telephone call, and then you get this squelching sound coming out of the couplers, and you would jam this thing down in there. Well, all of our lives went to hell when they suddenly started to invent modular telephones, and you couldn't stick these things in there anymore. So the technology has changed enormously, but where there is so much attention to analytics and the fine crunching of data, which Alain spoke to very, very nicely today, there still is a place, I think, in this world of hockey for storytelling, and that is my strength. I cover Montreal Canadiens games. I now fish from a pond of 31 teams, so I don't have to go to every Canadiens game, thank God. But I'll tell you, it's amazing that these stories that these gentlemen, certainly the legends of the game, have to tell are off the charts. I'll share a few of those with you today. I was gainfully employed at the Montreal Gazette in December of 2015 when Gary Mahar showed up in the press box at the Bell Centre during a Canadiens-Bruins game, and we just started to talk. And Gary's mom lives in Point Claire, a couple miles from my place, and we just started to talk, and in the second period, he's still there. And I said, this is more than a coincidence. This isn't really just a courtesy call. And he said, well, I know the work that you did covering the Montreal Canadiens centennial in 2009. We paid attention. Well, the NHL has a centennial coming, and we want you to come to work for us. And I mean, I was flattered. I said, would you mind if I finish writing my column on deadline before we start to talk? And so anyway, we continued to talk in days to come. 10 days after our first discussion, I'm still thinking, look, I've been in the newspaper business now for 28 years at the Gazette, for 28 years, and I'm comfortable, I'm familiar. I don't necessarily think at this point in my life I want to take the jump to go to an all-digital thing. I'm doing okay at the Gazette. And then Dickie Moore passes away. I covered Dickie's funeral. I wrote a piece that ran in the finite news space that we had in the print edition of the Montreal Gazette. And I got a call from John Moore, Dickie's son, and he said, I want to open up the family archives to you. And he showed me scrapbooks, and he took photographs, and there was Super 8 video, and there were pictures of Dickie sitting outside wearing a Montreal Canadiens windbreaker with a dog at his feet, and he gave all of this to me. I took all of this, produced the entire thing for our internet site. It was a huge package, obviously. I mean, Dickie at this point is a senior statesman of the Montreal Canadiens. He's not a third-line left winger. This guy's a legend. An Anglo who stayed in Montreal, I mean, made his life in business, and is a loyal Montreal. He bleeds red, white, and blue. I produced this entire package, turned it into my editor, said, okay, all you guys have to do, have one editor read it and just hit publish and put it online. 10 minutes later, he calls back, he says, it's too long for the internet. And I sort of stopped and I said, what am I missing here? I mean, this is not what the internet is supposed to do. I know I have this much space in print, but the internet is big. I can do lots of stuff. Our research tells us that our readers spend 2 minutes and 48 seconds with a story and then they want to move on. I said, if the reader's gone at 2:48, that's on me. It means that I haven't kept him there. If he's still there at 2:49, it means he's not going somewhere else to hit refresh to give you more beans to count. So I knew then, for me, it was up. I was done with the Gazette. So I left. The NHL hired me. I started with them on February 1st of 2016, and it has been an absolutely joyful 20 months. I was going to actually ask Gary on camera to come up and say, Gary, sorry you hired me, but I might not have liked the answer. So the changes in the game, the technology, it has changed so dramatically. I mean, from Underwood typewriters to Tandy laptops to what we do now to filing on iPhones to all of us who got into the business. We now actually, we're videographers, we're photographers. I joke that my life has more platforms than a diving meet. I mean, between Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all these different platforms that I'm servicing, one thing that to me has not changed is the process. While the methodology of delivering the news has changed, the process of getting a good story has not changed. And to me, that involves curiosity, research, building a trust with your subject, having a good ear, being able to change on the fly. I may be going one direction with an interview and the guy suddenly gives me this answer and it's 180 degrees this way. And never betraying a trust. And there are a lot of people in the business today. I won't speak to how anyone else works, but one of the most wonderful things in the world is to know that you have a good reputation. You have one chance in life to destroy it. And if you do, if you burn one guy by telling one story out of school that you shouldn't have told, or that just intuitively you know you shouldn't have told, then that guy's going to talk to someone else. And how do you look at yourself in the mirror the next day knowing that you've maybe negatively impacted someone who's opened his life to you? So I very much understand be first in this business, but I'm much more a proponent of be right. And the reason I talk about all these different platforms that we serve, this is how outrageous it is. I was at a Canadiens practice a couple years back in Brossard, and I'm looking down from the little press box to the bench, and all the water bottles are out on the top of the bench. and they all have their numbers on it, so the players drink their own bottles. Well, I look, and suddenly it occurs to me that there aren't the right number of bottles. So you start walking down, you're doing inventory, you're checking off numbers, and you say, okay, this guy's missing a match. Why aren't those guys skating today? They should be here. This should be a full practice. The alarm bell goes off on your head. You call your boss, it's on Twitter. Your colleagues start tweeting. It goes to your Facebook page. It's here, there, and I'm suddenly saying, this is what I'm doing. I got into this to be doing inventory of water bottles. But that is really, in a lot of ways, what this business has become. I mean, with 24-hour sports networks, with the channels that are going around the clock, with this intense competition, a lot of people now at Twitter, there's no accountability. People fire something out there, they can be totally, absolutely wrong. They can almost destroy someone's life, and they say, well, don't worry about it. Another 5 minutes, I'll tweet something else, it will be forgotten. Well, you know what, it won't be. So it's a very, very powerful medium, Twitter, as much so as what print used to be, where you pick up the newspaper, you read it, you'd be impacted by something. Twitter has that same kind of power. It's just now done in 280 characters. So it's a very different thing, but it still cuts to it. And one of the joys for me on Twitter is, as Carl said, I'm up at 5:30 in the morning sending him questions. I'll send some tweet, and I'll have some picture of this date in history in 1942, so-and-so did this, and I'll put that on Twitter. Literally, not a word of a lie. 10 minutes later, my phone beeps. It's Scotty Bowman. Scotty follows me on Twitter, says, see Bill Cowley in the back of that photo? I've got a story, call me. And I call Scotty, and for 20 minutes, we're talking back and forth. 3 hours later, Dick Urban phones me, hey, what about that picture? So where do you see it? He said, Scotty sent it to me. I said, well, of course Scotty sent it to you. You got it off my Twitter feed. But Scotty is one of these guys. Guy Lapointe called him the computer. Because, I mean, I did one story on one of his teams in the 1970s, and he said, my defenseman scored 71 goals that season, and I said, whoa, how do you know that? This is apropos of nothing we're talking about. It's not like you have that reference in front of you. And he said, no, I just know. He said, if John Van Boxmeer hadn't hit the goalpost in the second, whoa! And you dig back into it, you find the game story, and John Van Boxmeer hit the goalpost in the second period against whoever, right? And you're saying, this guy's a genius. So one of the beauties of this, by the time I arrived at the NHL, is I had this glorious digital Rolodex of numbers and contacts that I had made. And one story, I guess, when I was in Pittsburgh 2 years ago, packing my suitcase, leaving from Game 5 on my way up to Game 6 in San Jose, I got a call from New York that Gordie Howe had passed away. I called my boss and I said, don't look for me on that airplane. I'm sitting in my hotel room. I called room service, and for the next 16 hours I sat in my room, and I think I called 40 Hall of Famers. 30 of them took my call right away. Another 5 returned the call, and 5 more called me the next day to say, I'm sorry, I was unavailable. I just didn't get your call till now. So to be able to do things like that, and the fact that the league has really embraced what they're doing, I don't think that in all of this discussion, and Gary referred to this too about the centennial, what the NHL is doing, one of the things that's been interesting is that Gary Bettman, I think, understands, maybe neglected is too strong a word, but a lot of these legends, the guys on whose back the NHL was built over the last 100 years, have been just kind of ignored a little. They felt a little bit just tucked away. They've been, while you have the Connor McDavids and the Sidney Crosbys and the Ovechkins and the stars of the game, these guys sometimes feel a little bit shuffled off to the side. Well, what the NHL has done is they've embraced these guys, beginning with their greatest 100 NHL players, that the list that we did. I did, I think, 25 of those biographies. We've had these guys out at all these different events. They're at the All-Star Game, they're at the Hall of Fame, they're everywhere. And they really feel that they've been embraced to be made a part of the NHL family again. And that's been fantastic. So to sit and to talk with these guys and to listen to them tell their stories. I couldn't write fiction as good as the real lives that these guys led. And Dickie Moore famously once told me, the guys today are making a ton more money than I ever made, but they're not having a fraction as much fun as we did. When we rode the rails, when we're halfway home and someone throws a spittoon across the rail car and hits Rocket Richard in the head, he goes through the car with scissors and cuts everyone's pants off, and they all get off at Windsor Station or at Montreal West, all to go to a nice lunch with their wives, and they're all coming off in short pants in January. He says, that doesn't happen. So you're listening to these stories, and I guess over the years I've just learned there becomes an intuitive sense. No one has to say to me anymore, ever, that's on the record or that's not on the record. You just know I'm not going to write anything that's going to put anyone in a delicate position. And if I ever feel that something may be a little touchy, I will either just drop it completely or I will call and say, this was a wonderful line, can I use it? And 99 times out of 100, it's absolutely, we're good. That's great, but thank you for calling to ask. So many of these guys are just hugely appreciative of being simply remembered. But the fact now that they can tell their stories, my goal has been to keep the accomplishments of these guys alive while they're still with us, and those of them who have gone to tell their stories and to let people know that these were tremendous athletes who really played the game for the love of the game. And what's been really gratifying has been a grandson or a son of one of the players will call and say, I didn't know that about my dad or my grandfather. And I may have some photos that I've tucked aside, that I've scanned, that I've digitally archived, and I will send them some of the pictures that they might have never seen. So I'm going to just rattle through a couple stories that really kind of touched me and have touched me since I've been a writer, and some of the things I've done with the NHL and before. One certainly that has marked my career and really taught me a lot about myself was a piece that I wrote in November 1999 on Howie Morenz. The Montreal Gazette had a team of writers pick the top 10 sports moments in the city over the last 100 years as we were moving into the 2000s. One of them was the story of Howie Morenz and his fabulous career and how he was an incandescent talent, and then how he tragically lost his life as he did and was immortalized as really he was voted the greatest hockey player of the first half century of the 20th century. I took pretty much all the clippings, all the news stories, all the reports, everything that had been done previously, assembled them all, and basically wrote that. Howie Morenz Jr. Contacted me, and he said, for I don't know how many years I've been reading this stuff about my dad, and I've always kind of turned the other cheek. I can't do that anymore. I'm sorry, this one's still very, very personal. I sat with Howie Jr., we talked, and he got into his story about his father being, they said, my dad was an alcoholic, he roamed the streets, he changed his clothes 17 times a day, he ignored his family. Howie Jr. told me what was important to him and what man he knew as his father. And I wrote that story, and Howie sent me a photograph of his dad and his mom and his two siblings that was taken at a family picnic somewhere, and it was incredibly touching to me, and it taught me, turn over that next stone. Make that next phone call, just do it right. I failed Howie Sr. and I failed Howie Jr. and I failed the Morenz family that day. And I said, that's never going to happen again. I'll move on to Elmer Locke. Elmer became one of my great, great friends in hockey. I knew so much about Rocket Richard. I knew so much about Toe Blake. I knew nothing about Elmer. Elmer was the quietest, most modest superstar I've ever met in my entire life. He lived just a couple of blocks from my house. I'd phone him up and say, Elmer, I'm coming over. You gotta talk to me. And he'd say, I'm not. I said, Elmer, one day I'm going to show up on your doorstep, and you can open the door, and I'm going to be there, and you can have me in. And sure enough, he opened the door one day, and I was on the doorstep. Elmer said, come on, and I'll make you coffee. So we sit down, we start talking, and his second wife, he had remarried after he lost his first wife, starts telling me all these stories. And she's looking, and she keeps coming over, cuffing him in the back of the head, saying, Elmer, I didn't know it. Why don't you tell me any of this? I said, well, I was just a hockey player. Rocket and Toe and I were just average hockey players who made ourselves a little better. I said, yeah, 1, 2, 3 in scoring and the preeminent offensive line of the 1940s. Yeah, just average hockey players. So I said, okay, you must have the quintessential photograph of yourself with the punchline, with Rocket and with Toe. And he said, I don't really have anything in the house. He said, you can go look if you like. So I go downstairs to the basement. I'm walking around. It's an unfinished basement. There are tools and sawdust and bits and pieces. And anyway, I'm coming upstairs. I hadn't found anything. And behind the hot water tank, there's a picture frame. And it's sort of like this. And there's a crack down the side of it. And a fly has died and slid down behind it. And there's that much dust on the thing. And I take this thing down. It's the most arresting photograph of the punchline I've seen in my life. I've never seen this picture before. It's the 3 guys standing. Rocket's looking a little off camera, and the other 2 guys are like this. And it's yellow, it's weathered, it's yellowed, it looks a little dog-eared, and I bring it upstairs. And I said, Elmer, can you explain this? Of course, his wife cuffs him in the head. And he said, I guess it's been down there for a few years. I don't remember it. So I said, okay, well, here 2 things are going to happen here today. I'm taking this picture out of your house. I'm going to take it out of the frame. I'm going to clean it up. I'm going to digitize it. I'm going to archive it. I'm going to send it to the Hockey Hall of Fame, to the National Archives. I'm going to reframe it, and I'm going to bring it back on the sole condition it does not go down behind the hot water tank. And his wife laughed and said, don't worry, it won't. And so until the last day of Elmer's life, when he lived in that home, it was framed in a small, of course, Elmer had it tucked away in the side of the kitchen. He had to look for it, but at least it was on the ground floor. And that's the kind of guy that Elmer was. Well, I guess it would have been in March of I get March 28th, 2015. I'm standing outside the Canadiens dressing room. The Habs have just beat the Florida Panthers. They just qualified for the playoffs. And my cell phone rings, and I look down, and it's Elmer's stepdaughter. And I call her back, and she says, Elmer suffered a stroke, and it doesn't look good. So I went inside, finished off the story that I had to do that night, came back, went to the hospital the next day. An orderly knew Elmer because he'd been in and out of emergency a couple times over the years, and he had him tucked away. He was in a quiet corner. You know what emergency rooms are like. It was a mess, but he was tucked away in some quiet place. I went and sat with him, kind of combed his hair a bit, and we just sat. And his eyes were half open. He was unresponsive completely. And I just talked with him. I just wanted to talk to him. And about halfway through the conversation, I just said, so Elmer, like, your team made the playoffs last night. It's pretty cool. Like, they qualified. They made the show. Nothing at all. I said, I wonder what Rocket would think of it. And when I said Rocket, his hand literally squeezed mine so hard that he almost broke a knuckle. I had bruises on my hand. And I suddenly locked in on it. So I said, what do you think, Todd? You think Todd would like this team? What about Bill Dernan? Your old buddy Murph Chamberlain. I mean, what about him? And for about 10 minutes, he just squeezed my hand, and then he finally just let go. And I talked to his doctor later, and he said that might be the last thing that Elmer Locke will ever remember, but you just locked in on his team. So to have that kind of a relationship with a guy like that, who I had to camp out on his doorstep to originally get in to see him, I mean, that to me means more than talking to 1,000 NHL players today. To be able to go in and do something like that. I moved to Jean Beliveau. I got to know Mr. Beliveau from stories that I wrote about his work with children, with charity. Every story that you ever heard about Jean Beliveau, about him being this tremendous human being and a great ambassador of the game, I mean, they're all true, and they don't say enough. I mean, this man was gold. He was the gold standard for this hockey team. And on this documentary which just aired, and I've said this before, I said where Rocket Richard was the fire in the belly of the Montreal Canadiens, Jean Beliveau was the conscience of this team. And you can still walk through that building some nights. I used to look down from the press box, and I would see Jean's snow white hair on the aisle and 2 seats, and Elise Beliveau's snow white hair 2 in, and then I'd say, okay, now we can play hockey. Now we're ready to play a game of hockey. So I got to know Mr. Beliveau very, very well, and after he suffered his first stroke, I had a phone call from Elise, and she said if he'd like to come to the hospital to visit with him, he's not really up and around too much yet, but if you'd like to come and spend a half an hour, he'd be happy to see you. So I went in, and he was sitting in the corner. You knew what he looked like. He was perfect. He never had a hair out of place. Well, he was sitting in the corner wearing a hospital gown, and it looked like he combed his hair with a brick, and the corner of his mouth was down a little bit because he had suffered some from the stroke, and his faculty of speech had been dented a little. And he was just writing, and he just started handing me pieces of paper, and he would say, what do you think of this? I mean, it's autograph. And I said, it's your autograph. I mean, it looks like cursive script over the old blackboard. It's spectacular. Everyone knows a Jean Beliveau autograph. He said, but is it good enough? I said, good enough for what? He said, I'm not going to sign another autograph for a fan unless it's the way that fan expects that to be. Because from 1953, when he arrived in Montreal, until his first stroke, he answered every single piece of fan mail that he received by himself personally. Every piece. He had a secretary who handled it, who got it to him, and so on, but he would write, and he wouldn't just sign his name, he would send a message. And he famously told me one story that he had where some woman sent him a letter saying, my husband, I think he's going to leave me because he doesn't like my breast size. They should be larger. Can you send me some money to give me some enhancement surgery? And he said, I slept on this for weeks. I had no idea how to apply it. And then I finally wrote back and I said, ma'am, if he doesn't see like the glorious person who you are inside, I just don't know what to say. But I mean, to me, your personality radiates loveliness, and I think you're absolutely wonderful just as you are. And she wrote him back about 6 months later and said, I threw him out, and I'm going out with a new guy who loves my body. So, you know, when you spend time with guys like this, and when you have someone like Jean Beliveau telling you stories like that, finally I had a call from Elise who told me, look, someone on the internet has reported that we're basically holding a vigil at his bedside, expecting him to die any moment. My daughter is out playing golf this afternoon, and I have people, I'm going out to do some shopping. There's a nurse, there's a doctor who's in and out, but the end is not imminent. Can you please call off the dogs? And so I talked to a couple people and wrote a couple of stories. So when I covered Mr. Beliveau's illness, and then his death, and the wake that was held at the Bell Center, and finally his funeral, I had agreed to speak to Diana Swain on NBC or CBC News World shortly after the funeral. I left Mary Queen of the World at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon with a deadline for our iPad edition, which we were doing at the time of the Gazette. and I'm running back through the square, through Dorchester Square, and I turn and I look over my shoulder, and the coffin is just coming out of the church, and the snow is swirling. It was an absolutely awful day, if you remember. Elise said it was a beautiful day for a funeral for a hockey player, and she was right. It was perfect. It was just a glorious, spectacular winter day. And Diana Swains calls me. I answer the phone, and she says, "How was it?" And I turn and I look back over my shoulder. It was beautiful. It was, if there's such a thing as a beautiful funeral, Mr. Bellavos was absolutely spectacular. So the time that I spent with him over the years, I mean, I just count my blessings. And over the years, I guess when I was 10 years old, I received this little, I don't even know where it came from, a little white pin-back button of Jean Beliveau. They had them for hockey players. About the 1970, 71, I think, was the vintage of them. I don't know how it got to me. I don't know what the story was with this thing. Anyway, I loved it. I only saw Jean Beliveau's career on the back nine. I mean, I'm about 14 when he retires. But I kept that button and I loved it. And from the day that I got my job in newspapers, it always affected me how the relationship that I had built with him was so special as I was starting to write hockey. And I kept that button, and that's worn on my jacket. It has not been off my jacket for any one hockey game that I've covered my entire career, and goes over my heart when I close my jacket. And that's what Jean Beliveau means to me. And I know that we all have Jean Beliveau stories. He was larger than life in so many ways. Next Saturday is the 3rd anniversary of his passing. I can't believe it's been 3 years already, but I'll probably go to Mary Queen of the World and light a candle, and I'll talk to Elise that day. I may see her at a game that night, but he was one of a kind. I hated Dave Keon's guts. And I'll tell you why. And I told Dave Keon this. On the 2nd of May, 1967, the eve of my 10th birthday, the Canadians were playing Game 6 of Stanley Cup Final against the Toronto Maple Leafs. And some of us of a certain age will know that we were allowed to watch 2 periods of the hockey game, and our father said, "Time for bed, it's a school night." So I go to bed, and my dad says, "Don't worry, there'll be a Game 7, you'll get to watch them." So I wake up on my 10th birthday, and I said to my dad, "So when's Game 7? He said, "Son, Canadians lost. The Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup." And my father told me that I said that morning, "I hope the Maple Leafs never win the Stanley Cup again."
Stubbs curse.
I fast forward 50 years, and I'm sitting New Year's Eve in Toronto. The NHL was starting to unveil its top 100. They were announcing the first 33. Dave Keon is sitting at a table. I had bumped into Dave, our paths had crossed. I'd never actually had a chance to sit and talk with him at all. So I finally went over, sat down with him. I said, "Dave, I got to ask you a question. 1967, the 2nd of May, the next morning I'm going to be turning 10. I'm a huge Montreal Canadiens fan. You guys, you're a bunch of old-timers, you're a bunch of old fogies. You have no business winning the Stanley Cup. Alan Stanley comes out last face-off, beat Jean Beliveau on the draw, they score into an empty net. You guys win the 6 games. How does it feel 50 years later to know that you destroyed a 10-year-old kid's birthday?" And Dave stopped for a minute and he rubbed his chin. He said, "It feels pretty damn good, actually." And since that day, from last New Year's Eve, Dave Keon and I have become like this. I mean, I see him at a lot of events. I spend time with him. His wife is an absolute charm. She stole my NHL lapel pin off of my jacket a couple nights ago in Toronto. I don't even know. She called me from Florida to say she had stolen it, so I replaced it with a Stanley Cup pin on the other side. But she and Dave they're fantastic. There's not a bad person in hockey from that time. All of these people that I've met, sometimes you don't ever want to meet the heroes who you've had because you just fear they're not going to live up to being on that pedestal where you had them. But all of these people do. They're all fantastic. They're great. One of my favorite people in hockey is Glenn Hall. Glenn is one of the absolute princes in this game. He's wonderful. I have a standing invitation. Anytime I go out to Edmonton, I have an invitation to go out to his ranch. He still lives on the same ranch, the same farm that he bought, 100 and some odd acres. And there's a famous story about the barn, right? I tell my general manager about painting the barn. I can't come and talk contract yet. Well, he showed me that barn, and the barn is 60 feet by 40 feet. And I asked him once, I said, does that mean anything to those numbers? He says, "Yeah, it's 10 times the size of the goal net, and it's exactly the size of the net that was behind me some nights." I mean, and Glenn he's an absolute scream. When I was leaving his farm one day, I picked up, there was a pine cone, thousands and thousands of them. I picked it up and put it in my pocket as a souvenir. Finally, I think about 3 years later, racked by guilt, I call him up. I said, "Glenn," I said, "I got to confess something. I took a pine cone off your lawn like 3 years ago." "So So that's where it went. That's Glenn, right? Well, I mean, Glenn Hall is one of the funniest men on earth, and what I've basically done is I've compiled over a number of years a compendium just of some of Glenn's greatest hits. And if you, like Glenn, he played 502 consecutive games, right? Without a mask, he played 552, including the playoffs. So those records are out of touch. But this guy is so quiet that what he says is so funny. So I'm just going to read a couple of the quotes that I've gathered from him over the years that I've interviewed him. I do nothing better than anybody you ever knew. I can go out and do nothing all day, and it'll take a long time to do it. And I think that might be the best quote that I've heard from any professional athlete ever. Pressure is the greatest asset in the world. When I was whistling and humming, I was horse shit, and I wasn't whistling and humming very often. So I mean, you look at Glenn's record. Moose Vasco weighed 222 pounds only once, and that was on the way up. He'd get his hair and fingernails cut before his weigh-in, and he'd only step on the scale after a deep exhale. And this one, I'll leave you with, this was a great one. I had 2 assists in 1965-66, and Al, and he's talking about Al McNeil, a Blackhawks defenseman, had none. And I reminded Al of this often during the season. Al said, I'll catch you if I have a good second half and I stay healthy. At the end of the year, I have 2 assists, Al has 1, so Al announces, I know how this happened. Glenn played all the power plays. Somebody like Johnny Bauer, I mean, I've got to know Johnny really well over the years, and I have a thing for goalies. Goalies are like catchers, I guess, in baseball, because the entire game is played out in front of them. I mean, they just have a different vision. And there's not a goaltender who it doesn't have a good story to tell. Johnny did this awful Christmas story, a song for kids, I guess back in the 60s. Was it Honky the Christmas Blues? And you can still find it on the internet. Well, Johnny didn't have a copy of the 45 RPM. He just did not have it. So I wrote a story about this. Well, some ambulance attendant in Thunder Bay reads this story. It's syndicated. It's running in some paper up in Northern Ontario. He says, I've got that in my attic. And so he drives down to Mississauga and turns up on Johnny's doorstep and he hands him the 45 RPM. Johnny freaks out, has him in, he signs him a pile of autographs, some pucks, jerseys, sticks, all these different things. And then Johnny puts the thing on a cassette and sends it to me. And for about 10 years afterwards, I took that cassette and I put it on my answering machine at work. And anytime anyone called me about a week before and 2 days after Christmas, I'd get Honky the Christmas. Look it up online, it's horrible. But and Ted Lindsay. I sat down with Ted Lindsay 20 months ago at the Joe Louis Arena and spent about an hour with him alone. And Ted, I mean, terrible Ted. I mean, you know the pictures of him with a stick. I mean, you know, there had been a death threat on him. He's standing in the arena pointing a stick like, you want it? Bring it on, right? I mean, Ted said he loved going into the corners because that's where you learned where the men were and where the mice were. He said you just went into the corner and if you came out, and in the Olympia with the old mesh, and you take a guy's face and drag it along the screen. But Ted, since his retirement, I mean, what he's done for autism research, he's raised millions of dollars, and he's the biggest hearted guy I've ever met. And he's also a marshmallow inside. We're sitting talking about his trade. When Jack Adams, when he started work to form the Players Union, and Adams just flipped out, stripped the Red Wings for parts, shipped him and Glenn Hall off to Chicago. He plays in Chicago for 3 years, retires for 4. Sid Abel becomes GM of the Red Wings and says, I'd like you to come back. He says, what, you want an ambassador? He says, no, I want you to play. Ted says, I haven't played in 4 years. He says, don't worry, you can play. So Ted, they keep it totally secret, totally undercover. You try to imagine that in today's day and age of social media. Ted steps out onto the ice in the Olympia. The crowd suddenly sees who it is, and they just blow the roof off the place. So I asked Ted about this. I said, what's going through your head and your heart when you step out onto the ice and you see, you hear the crowd welcome you? And Ted just sat and looked at me and he started to cry. And I didn't know which way to look. I'm thinking, this man is bulletproof. These guys don't cry. I mean, Ted Lindsay is a warrior. I mean, you want to talk about a guy who's a skating tank. But it meant so much to him. This guy bled the red of the winged wheel that you just knew that this meant so much to him. Jerry McNeil played between Bill Durnan and Jacques Plante from Montreal Canadiens. Won the Stanley Cup in 1953, was the guy in goal for Bill Barilko's goal. Is known probably more for that than any save he made. I got to know Jerry really well in the latter stages of his life. And he said, I often wondered what today's modern goaltending equipment looks like. I said, well, why don't I bring you down to the Bell Center? We'll find out. So I pulled up at Jerry's doorstep. He's got a green garbage bag and he has his equipment. I said, where's it from? He said, oh, my grandson's kept it in Ottawa. So I'm bringing it down to the rink. So we walk into the dressing room. Jose Theodore's sitting in his stall waiting. This is all set up. And he takes the bag and he says, Jose, I brought you my equipment. He drops it on the floor. And Theo looks at it and says, where's the rest of it? Jerry says, there is no rest of it. This is it. And Theodore says, you kid, I wouldn't play road hockey in this. Are you kidding me? And not a word of a lie. Within 5 minutes, Theodore has those ratty old pads and the belly protector and the horrible gloves on his body, and he's down flopping on the carpet in the Montreal Canadiens dressing room. And what occurred to me, these were two lodge brothers. It didn't matter how many years they had played apart. It didn't matter that these guys were decades removed from having played for the Montreal Canadiens. The fact is, these guys had both played for the Habs. They were both goalies, and by that very reasoning, they were brothers. And so, you know, you sit and you get stories like that from Jerry. And it's funny, Mark showed his thing here on Jean Beliveau. I was at Jerry's, in his hospital when he was in his last days with cancer. And I was just sitting talking with him, and he kept telling me story after story. And he finally looked over and he just saw these reporters' eyes. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I should be recording this stuff. And he said, did you bring a notebook? I said, yeah. He says, well, maybe you want to write down some of this. I wouldn't mind if you tell it. And I suddenly clicked in that he was happy to tell some of these stories, to have me pass them along. When I wrote an appreciation of his life and his career, a couple days later, all those stories factored into it. Last two I'll give you quickly. Rogie Vachon was my guy. As a kid growing up in Pointe-Claire, I mean, playing road hockey, Rogie was my guy. He was the first professional athlete I ever wrote a fan letter to. He had played in the 66, 67 season. It was the old Punch In Like Junior B goaltender and all this stuff. And then the next fall, there's rumors that he's going to be sent back down to the Houston Apollos. And I write him a fan letter, Rogie, you're my favorite. Please don't let them send you down. Well, he sends me back the David Beard postcard. The old pose like this, right? And he sends a paragraph on the back of it. Thank you for being a fan. Don't worry. I'm never going to be sent back down again. Of course he wasn't. Fast, I got to know him over the years, did a couple stories. 50 years later, Rogie and I, last November, he came to Montreal, dropped the puck. The Canadiens paid a bit of a tribute to him. And then he flew up to Toronto for his Hall of Fame induction. And I changed my travel, and Rogie and I flew up together. And we're flying in, and he's telling me all these stories. And he says, yeah, Bobby Hull once dented my leg with a shot. What you're wearing, the big fake, Tennessee leather pads, and what, dented? He said, yeah. And he pulls up his pant leg, and you saw his shin come down like this, and there's literally a dent from a Bobby Hull slap shot that he still has. And we're talking, and he said, like, so this is now 50 years later, almost at the day that he took his first trip from Montreal to Toronto on a train to play as a rookie. Now we're going up his Hall of Fame induction, and we're pretty tight. We're close. We're on the phone with each other probably once every 2 weeks just to shoot the breeze and do whatever. Anyway, never flown into Billy Bishop Airport before. If you've ever flown in there, it's great flying downtown, right? So we're coming in, and Rogie's looking out the window. All he sees are these big buildings, and he sees water. And the buildings are getting larger, and the water's coming up. And he sort of says, there's an airport here, right? And I sort of look at it. I think so. And the next thing you see is Rogie, like he's hanging onto the seat. Of course, we touch down, right? And then someone tells me, yeah, this airport's been here for a while. So he smacks me, and that to me is my highlight of all of that. The last guy I'll tell you about, for all of these guys, Hall of Famers, legends, superstars, there was a gentleman by the name of Dick Meisner who played 171 games for the Bruins and the Rangers between 1959 and 64. I talked about that button that I have. In syrup, jelly powders, and Salada tea, they used to have these little plastic coins, right? There's my Dick Meisner. This thing was in a junk drawer. It would be in a shoebox. It would be wherever. I have no idea why it followed me around. I don't know. I never took care of it particularly. It just was always there. At some point about 15 years ago, I saw this thing and I said, I don't call Dick Meisner. I don't find Dick Meisner. See if he's still around. So I called the NHL Players Association to give me a number. He's running a cement company out in Portland, Oregon. I call him, Mr. Meisner. Hi, I'm Dave Stubbs from Montreal. Hello? He figures it's one of his buddies pulling a prank on him. So he hangs up on me the first 3 times until I finally get enough of this story out. And I tell him, I said, like, you weren't one of the superstars of the day. You were one of 120 players on whose backs the NHL was built during the time that you played. And I've had this coin, and what do you remember about it? And we got into talking, and we became pen pals, and we'd phone and we'd talk, and he was sending me pictures of the Bruins from the early 60s lined up outside that big brass thing at Windsor Station where they were about to get on the train to go back to Boston. Sent me a ton of pictures, everything else. I finally said, you know what, this thing has meant so much to me, but honestly, like if you'd like this for your grandkids or something, I'd be happy to send it to you. He said, don't worry, son, I've got about 500 of them and I can't get rid of them. So that's, I've bored you with enough of the anecdotal stuff. I mean, clearly the passion of hockey, working for the NHL now, covering the Centennial, and talking to these gentlemen, these great gentlemen, and they're wonderful people. It is absolutely fabulous. I mean, I really count my blessing. I enjoyed very much the time I spent in print journalism, but this is just, and I figure my best work is still ahead of me, and I enjoy enormously spending time with any of these guys. And next weekend, actually, I'll be in Chicago. Tony Esposito's invited me to come. He's going to be working the United Center corporate boxes, so I'll go and spend 2 days with him just hanging out with Tony O. And he was one of the guys I loved as a kid. So I mean, to be doing this, I'm black and blue because I'm pinching myself constantly. But thank you for indulging me here and for inviting me today. It was very kind of you, Jean Petrus. Thank you a million for having me. This has been just great. I don't know how much time I have left. I know you guys, the beer in Montreal is cold. You're going to want to get out. I'm in no hurry to go down to see the Canadians and the Sabres tonight, trust me, so I'm here for a bit. If anybody wants to, if you have any questions. Oh, this was a dandy. This is a meal, this is a ticket for one meal in the press box at the Montreal Forum. Carl, what do you think it'll get me?
Probably half a beer.
Half a beer, there you go. So I don't have a lot of memorabilia, but I have some things that are very special to me. For some reason, the uneaten meal in the press box, and you know what, the hot dogs, they talk about how good the hot dogs are in Montreal. They're not as good at the Bell Center as they were at the Forum. I'm sorry. Just don't do it. So anyway, thank you again very much.